inspiration in order to keep going, or something to strive for. These videos are really to help you out, to keep you inspired. So if you want to be inspired, make sure to subscribe and make sure to like this video, and don't forget to comment down below who you guys would like to see next. But since this is the first video I've ever done on Low Loaded, I'm going to break his hair down from start to finish on how he actually began his dreadlocks, based on how they look and how he's maintained them, and we'll talk about other things about his dreadlocks as well. But the first thing you always want to know about someone's dreadlocks is their hair type. Based on their hair type, it's easy to tell how they started their dreadlocks or what method they chose in order to get them. Because for each hair type, there's different methods you can choose. For instance, with the straight hair, there's only a few selective methods you can use in order to get dreadlocks. For instance, with straight hair, you can only do, twist and rip, and you can do back combing, you can do instant locking with the crochet needle. But those are practically the only 3 methods I would recommend for straight hair dreadlocks. So speaking of hair types, his hair type looks like it's about a 4B. And a lot of people always have the question why I review so many people with that 4B hair type. And a lot of people don't realize that most of the people that you recommend have that 4B hair type, because dreadlocks are more suitable for the 4B or even 4C or even a 4A hair type. Reason being is because the 4 range hair type is easy to lock up. And if you don't know anything about hair types, or you don't even understand what I'm talking about, I suggest you go check out the video, What is my hair type? Link down below in the description. But understanding a hair type really gives you a clear picture on how to actually get dreadlocks. And what I mean by the 4 range hair type being more suitable for dreadlocks just means that it's easier for that hair type to get dreadlocks. Doesn't mean that you can't get dreadlocks with a 3 range or a 2 range or even a 1, which is straight hair. You can get dreadlocks with any hair type. But just know, the straighter the hair becomes, the less methods you have to choose from, and the tougher it is for your hair to actually lock up, and the longer it takes for your hair to lock up. And vice versa. With a tighter curl pattern, the easier it is for it to lock up, the shorter amount of time it takes for it to lock up, and you have more methods to choose from. So that's what I mean by more suitable. Now with his hair being a 4B, there's many methods he could have chose from, just like I said. He could have started out the traditional route, which is what I'm leaning towards based on what his hair looks like, which what I mean by traditional is twisting with gel. A lot of people do start their dreadlocks out with twisting with gel, and then eventually migrate into other maintenance methods. So we'll go ahead and stick with that. Now, anytime I do a video on somebody, I'm telling you what they possibly could have done to get their hair the way that it looks now. And if you were to follow the steps, you can get your hair to look exactly like theirs. Now, even if they were to do something a little different than what I'm telling you, you can still achieve the same look. So let's go ahead and go with the twisting with gel route. And the reason I'm saying he started out with twisting with gel is because all of his tips and the lengths of his dreadlocks are very uniform. They're all relatively the same size, which then leads me to believe that he did start out with twisting with gel, which is very popular, and I would say about 50 to maybe even 60% of people with dreadlocks start out with the twisting with gel method. And the reason that is because a lot of people don't realize that there are other methods you can choose from. And believe it or not, the other methods are sometimes easier depending on what your hair type is and also what you're trying to achieve. For instance, the instant locking method. If you do the instant locking method using the Dreadlocks crochet hook, you can literally have dreadlocks within a day versus doing twisting with gel, which will take you literally, I would say, 6 to maybe even 12 months of allowing your hair to lock up in order for it to be fully mature versus using the crochet hook. So that just goes to show the polar opposites between an instant locking method versus a traditional route of dreadlocks. And that's why I told you about 60% of people have traditional dreadlocks because they don't know of the other methods. And believe it or not, a lot of locticians only provide the twisting with gel method. And the reason they do that is because it allows them to retain a client, because you have to constantly be going back to them for at minimum a year until your hair locks up fully, which there's nothing wrong with that. Locticians do an amazing job on hair, but if you don't want to spend a lot of money on your hair, there are alternatives, just like the tools provided on greatlocks.com. But speaking about doing maintenance, we see that his hair is more of a freeform style, but we can definitely label his hair semi-freeform, because it's very easy to see that he did most likely start out with twisting with gel, but then you're able to see that some of the dreadlocks are actually congos, and that just comes from not maintaining the roots. So if you start out with twisting with gel and you never maintain the roots, it will result in congos, which a congo is essentially 2 or more dreadlocks into one. So that means that there's one dreadlock coming out of the root, but then there's either 2 or more tips on that actual dreadlock. which in my opinion, I really love Congos. Congos make your hair very unique and it gives it a freeform look. Another thing you need to realize about his dreadlocks and semi-freeform dreadlocks as well is that the roots are very unmaintained, or they're very puffy, or they're very frizzy, whatever language you want to use. That's how his roots are. Now this is actually very easy to achieve. It's simply not maintaining your hair after you have initially locked it up. So if we take it back, just what I've already told you, with this hair type being a 4B, him starting out with twisting with gel, and then after initially locking up, he then allows it to do its own thing. And as far as I know, that's what he's been doing this whole time, is just allowing his hair to lock up on its own after he has initially locked it up with the twisting with gel method. And that's simply all you have to do for semi-freeform dreadlocks. And I feel like 90% of the artists that have dreadlocks have semi-freeform dreadlocks. And we've seen this with so many people, from Lil Pump to Lil Uzi Vert to Lil Wayne. We see that with Lil Loaded. We've seen that with Young Thug. We see that with Jaden Smith. We've seen that with Sway Lee. There's so many people that have semi-freeform dreadlocks to where they have maintained it very little and then allowed it to mostly freeform, which semi-freeform is essentially just freeform, just with a little bit of maintenance. Semi-freeform can even be maintaining it, once a year or once every 6 months. It's just very little maintenance, allowing it to lock up primarily on its own, which in my opinion is one of my favorite sets of locks. But over time, you're able to see that more and more, the top of his head is being more developed as a freeform style of dreadlocks. One thing you will notice is that only on top of his head is where most of the clumping or the bulk of his dreadlocks is happening. And the reason being, which I always mention this, the top of your head gets the less traction and the less friction. So with that being said, the dreadlocks don't get as developed as the rest of your head. For instance, the back or the sides of your head. And typically because the back and the sides of your head get the most traction and most friction from sleeping, or even just sitting down and resting your head. Even something as little as that, or even just wearing a hat. If you notice about a hat, the hat only presses on the sides and the back of your head versus the top. Or I would say that's where the most pressure is. And that's essentially what happens with dreadlocks. And there are pros and cons to pressure or tension and traction. And obviously if you overdo it, that can result in what's called traction alopecia, which then results in hair loss, which traction alopecia is essentially the pore in which your hair grows out of, or the hair follicle grows out of, becomes swollen, and essentially your scalp will choke out your hair from it being swollen. But I mean, it takes quite a bit in order for that to happen. And obviously we didn't see Lil Loaded with that issue at all. Typically traction alopecia happens from very tight braids or very tight retwists, and you will feel it. If you feel any tension on your scalp, it's best to relieve that as best as possible. Sometimes it's best to sacrifice a very clean look with more of a comfortable look. Like, don't do too tight of a retwist, or don't get your hair braided too tight, because the results can be pretty devastating if you don't do it properly. Now fast forwarding to more of a recent photo, we're able to see that the top of his head still was developing more freeform-like, and the sides were developing more uniform than the rest of the head. And it's just like how I said, that it's just because the top of the head doesn't get a lot of attention, especially when allowing your hair to freely form. But it is really cool to see that, and you're able to see how thick the dreadlocks are on top of the head compared to the sides and back of the head. And overall, he did have a very unique style of dreadlocks, and even though he did start out with more of a maintenance method, you still see how unique his dreadlocks are because he allowed it to freeform afterwards. And maybe that's something that you want to do. Maybe you want your dreadlocks to be a little bit more unique. And you can even start today with just allowing your hair to lock up on its own, see where it goes, and you can slowly guide it in the direction that you want it to go in. So it kind of goes hand in hand. Your hair maintains itself and you